I've been in more than a few workshops, conversations, or lectures where writers are talking about this topic as though it's a difficult, even mysterious topic, the unreliable narrator. What does that mean? Ask 10 different writers about what they think an unreliable narrator is, and you'll likely get 10 different answers. It makes it seem like this is a difficult and perplexing issue. It actually isn't. There's good scholarship on the matter for anyone willing to read it. Are you noticing a theme here? I'm going to present a framework for thinking about the reliability of your narrators that should help take a lot of the mystery out of this topic. Once you have a clear grasp of what makes a narrator unreliable, you'll probably find, as I did, that a lot of the confusion is overblown and unnecessary. Let's take a look at a seriously unreliable narrator to start this conversation. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lo-li-ta. The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lo-li-ta. She was low, plain low in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in 1 sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms she was always Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did, indeed she did. In point of fact, there might have been no Lolita at all, had I not loved, one summer, a certain initial girl child, in a princedom by the sea. Oh, when? About as many years before Lolita was born as my age was that summer. You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what the seraphs, the misinformed, simple, noble-winged seraphs envied. Look at this tangle of thorns. This narrator, of course, is Humbert, sociopath, pedophile, and self-declared fancy prose stylist. Reluctantly, I have to agree. In this brief opening chapter, Humbert begins his tale in classical confessional style, in putting some pretty shocking confessions out there from the start, admitting to molesting a schoolgirl and being a murderer. But even if there's the appearance of honesty here in this confession, there's something about the style that belies it. The still obsessive, longing way Humbert writes of Dolores speaks far more to justification than confession. It's an attempt to plead helplessness to a passion that had overwhelmed him. This is, of course, as sly and well-styled as it may be, abhorrent. But you get sucked in by this narrator. It's hard not to get swept up in the poetry of it. This narrator, my friends, is a true sociopath, as unreliable as narrators come. In Nabokov's foreword, an entirely fictional professor writes the following of Humbert. No doubt he is horrible, he is abject. He is a shining example of moral leprosy, a mixture of ferocity and jocularity that betrays supreme misery perhaps, but is not conducive to attractiveness. He is ponderously capricious. Many of his casual opinions on the people and scenery of this country are ludicrous. A desperate honesty that throbs through his confession does not absolve him from sins of diabolical cunning. He is abnormal. He is not a gentleman. But how magically his singing violin can conjure up a tendresse, a compassion for Lolita that makes us entranced with the book while abhorring its author. It puts the reader in an awkward situation. You know from the outset that Humbert is a liar and, quote, a shining example of moral leprosy. Yet that singing violin does attempt to con the reader into a kind of deranged sympathy for Humbert. What exactly is going on here? How can we put Humbert, a clearly unreliable narrator, in the same category as Huck, another unreliable narrator? What's up with that? A lot has been written of unreliable narrators because they're useful tools. The mere existence of a compelling fictional character can bring a reader to empathize with them, no matter how horrible they may be, simply because they're the protagonist. What does empathizing with Humbert in some odd way say about us? Meanwhile, Huck proves a compelling critic of slavery and racism because of his innocence and cutting, childlike understanding of the world he inhabits. How are these two very unreliable narrators different? The best way to get at what's going on with unreliable narrators, in Rowe's view, comes from the narratologist James Phelan. Phelan's method for questioning unreliability is a neat, elegant little heuristic that asks you to consider the jobs a narrator performs, and then evaluate the ways the narrator does or doesn't perform them. Even that makes it sound much more complex than it is. Phelan highlights the narrator's three jobs as paramount. First, reporting information. Second, interpreting the information presented. Third, judging the information they're relating. And to make it just that much easier, Phelan gives us a tidy three-point alliteration to go along with it. Reporting sounds just like what it is. The narrator tells their reader what happens in the story world. Reading, the way the narrator interprets or reads the events that they are describing. Is it clear the narrator understands what's going on? Is a drunk character really reading the situation clearly when the bartender asks him to leave? Regarding, the way a narrator regards the situation they are describing depends on their ethical judgment of the situation. Is a sociopathic character really going to judge the actions presented fairly? According to Phelan, there are two main ways a narrator can fail to do these three jobs. They can misreport, misread, or misregard, or they can underreport, underread, or underregard. To miss, in this sense, means to get the information wrong. Misreporting would be giving the reader false information. Misreading would be misinterpreting the information presented. And misregarding would be failing to judge the ethics of a situation correctly. Likewise, underreporting would be withholding relevant information. Underreading would be when a lack of knowledge causes the narrator to interpret a situation incorrectly. And underregarding is a character failing to completely grasp the full ethical implications of a situation, even though they may be presenting the events clearly. Perhaps the best way to put this model into action is by contrasting Humbert and Huck. Let's look at Huck first. Huck may be a kid, but we have good cause to think he's honest. The novel's opening paragraph signals that he cares about telling the truth, mostly. And just as readers don't have cause to doubt much of the information Huck presents, Huck doesn't have much cause to give false information, misreport, or hide anything, underreport. So Huck's pretty reliable in this regard. Huck has an encounter midway through the novel with a feuding family, very much like the Capulets and the Montagues. And here he reports the events accurately as he sees them, but it's clear to the reader that there's far more going on there than Huck can grasp, as the daughter of the family he's staying with is rushing straight toward a Shakespearean tragedy. Huck isn't misreading the situation because he doesn't get it wrong. Here he's just failing to connect the dots, underreading. Lastly, Huck struggles throughout the story with the ethics of aiding in Jim's escape. Helping a slave escape is against the law, and though Huck thinks he's risking eternal damnation, he still helps Jim. Again, here, I'd say Huck isn't misregarding because he gets his actions just right. Some part of him knows he's doing the right thing by doing wrong by the laws of the day. But his uncertainty points to an inability to completely grasp the ethics of the situation, and he certainly can't articulate it. Here, Huck is underregarding, but the reader knows he's on the right track. So while Huck is reliable in some ways, he's unreliable in others, and asking the right questions about how he's unreliable helps us to understand the character more clearly. Huck's a trustworthy kid with a good heart who sometimes watches quizzically as events go flying over his head. Humbert is another case entirely. It's a lot harder to know what to make of anything this narrator relates. He openly admits on the first page to some of the facts of the story, sure. So it's tempting to give in to the belief that he might be a reliable reporter of the case he shares. But he also claims to have memory lapses in the course of his telling, and even infers his own insanity, probably the reader might infer, to discourage the reader from judging him as harshly as they would a sane person. Best bet here is that Humbert is simply not to be trusted. Because of Humbert's obvious penchant for misreporting, it becomes difficult to judge whether he's misreading as well. Certainly his interpretation of Dolores's actions are clouded by his sexual obsession with her. But whether that's a misread of actions that actually happened or whether it's a misreporting of completely false events is difficult to say. What we can say pretty clearly is that in every respect, Humbert is misregarding. It seems his narrative is as much an attempt to convince himself of his justifications for his actions as it is an endeavor to win over the hypothetical members of the jury hearing it. As for what Humbert knows, there are plenty of signs he understands just how depraved he is. There's certainly a strong case to be made that his moral compass knows which way north is, and he simply chooses to ignore it and justify the whole thing subsequently, which makes him all the more reprehensible. As far as his reliability in terms of reading the events he describes in the novel, nil. The sociopathic pedophile gets 0 points. So, those are just 2 quick examples of the countless unreliable narrators in the fictional universe. I've chosen these 2 as a way of demonstrating just how vastly different unreliable narrators can be. They're all unreliable in different ways, which is to say, they're characters. You might find yourself writing a robot who misunderstands human emotions, or a 6-year-old, or an addict justifying their weaknesses and faults. I've found Phelan's categories of unreliability to be the right mix of easy to apply while still illuminating the important features of the character narrator. Perhaps this seems an academic discussion, and perhaps it is. It should be said, though, that occasionally academics have something useful to say about writing fiction. Hopefully, this proves to be one of those cases for your writing. Knowing just how your narrator is or isn't reliable will never hurt you in presenting them just that much more clearly.